Welcome to Convergences, a political theory show from Zero Books at the intersections of emancipation and critical imagination. This is Adam from Massive Horizon, and today I'm joined by activist and researcher Kieron Turner to discuss the work of Cedric Robinson. We're going to be focusing on his text, Black Marxism, the Making of the Black Radical Tradition. We're going to be covering Robinson's life and work, his dialectical analysis of racial capitalism, his critique of Marxist historiography, and the life and history of the Black radical tradition and its articulation of consciousness as material force, as examined through the world historical experience of African peoples. Kieron has been a great promoter of Robinson's work in recent times, particularly amongst sections of the British left, and Robinson's work remains a strong theoretical touchstone, both in his academic research on Palestinian direct action, as well as in his work with direct action groups themselves, such as Palestine Action, who were crucial in recently shutting down an Israeli-owned arms factory in Oldham, England, earlier this year, taking one more cog out of the imperialist death machine. Kieron, welcome to Convergences.
Hello, thank you very much. Thanks for such a... I'm not usually as interesting as probably described, but thank you for having me on.
New Socialist already took king of the reading group, so what more can we do? So, first of all, who was Cedric Robinson, his background, his legacy, and how the work developed?
So, the thing about Robinson that I think is really interesting and has only started to be spoken about, particularly at the recent Institute of Race Relations conversation, which was online, which had Avery Gordon, Joshua Myers, who wrote his new biography, and then his late wife, Elizabeth Robinson, who's also an activist in her own right, is that for a lot of conversations around things like Black Power, the Black Panthers, the emergence of things like the radicalism that would take on the Institute of Race Relations, and then the formation of the journal Race and Class, was the fact that Robinson was actually there. He was in the background, he was doing work, he was writing papers, he was converging with all of these people, he was doing activism. As Myers talks about in his really great biography, which I would recommend for people, it was his experiences in his life, and particularly things like his university work, his student activism, which then set the course for what would later become works that are popularly known, such as Black Marxism, Black movements in America, but then also less well-known works such as An Anthropology of Marxism and The Terms of Order. Robinson was involved in a number of student struggles against his university. One particular one is the university stopped Malcolm X coming to talk at the university. And even though Robinson didn't necessarily agree with all of Malcolm X's points, he was still very much opposed to the fact that it was clear that radical, and especially Black radical activists, were not being allowed to speak on campus, despite all of the talk of kind of free speech and free intellectual inquiry. And Robinson wrote such a scathing letter to the university management that they suspended him for 6 months, where he originally wanted to go to Cuba, but ended up traveling to Mexico and ended up living amongst the urban and rural poor, and wrote to a friend at the time saying how shocked he was essentially at the immiseration of American imperialism on poor Mexican people. And it was experiences like that, experiences involved in the forms of student struggles at University of Berkeley, I believe, that informed what was to become a more critical consciousness. One of the key things that is also missed out in terms of his work is the fact that his original undergraduate was in anthropology, which the reason he and a friend took that was essentially because it was the only subject that would actually speak about Black people, rather than the long focus on white scholars and white in European history. But the fact that he took anthropology is actually very important for the way that he actually engages with his work. If you look at his works, especially things like An Anthropology of Marxism, there is that kind of radical, critical, kind of ethnographic relationship, and the way he treats writers, their works, their ideas, situates them in historical context in a way that I think is quite rare. So then when we get on to specifically his looking at the works of C.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, and Richard Wright, it is that kind of anthropological as well as historical and political work kind of that comes through. But then moving through, as I said, in terms of his relationship to the Institute of Race Relations and things, it's the fact that his role involved in these struggles and these conversations about the developments of things like race and class, Black Power, the Black Panthers, is that his contribution has been and continues to be ignored. So now that things like there's been a recent re-edition of Black Marxism, the third edition last year, for some people he's kind of popped out of nowhere, when actually he's been, him and his work and his ideas have actually been there and been influencing people for a very long time.
It just feels criminal just reading the introduction to the latest edition by Robin D.G. Kelly, and you get these lists of literally hundreds of organizations that have taken this analysis of racial capitalism, which is born in Black Marxism, to heart, and it becomes part of the very tradition that's trying to, I wouldn't say elevate, but simply, he does say at one point, even merely suggesting that it's there in the eyes of predominantly white Eurocentric forms of the academy. And I think this edition, if everyone's going to pick it up for the preface alone, and that will convince you to read the rest of it, because it's quite a big one, but it's very incredibly readable. This parallel radicalism, which is, it undergirds the very struggles that European thought considers, but European thought, given its epistemological presuppositions, particularly the ones of European anthropology, which originate not simply in the 20th century, people like Levi Strauss and Marcel Mauss and people like that, but Kant and Hegel, and Kantian Hegelian anthropology. Kantian, on the first part, was a incredibly racist doctrine, which has occluded the epistemologies of how so many other Western radicalisms, even the radicalisms that try to undermine their own roots, carry forth those roots into their own analyses of history and of capitalist exploitation.
Well, yeah, completely. And it's something in which, again, we see throughout Black Marxism. I was rereading parts of the introduction today, in where he talks about essentially the way in which Marxism obviously has become the dominant form of political and theoretical critique and tradition against the violences of what we might call modernity, if not capitalism, but the ways in which the Black radical tradition, which he calls an alternative resolution to this social order, has had to be obliterated. And he speaks about this in chapter 4, and specifically in types of anthropological and historiographical work that you're talking about, that the existence of a tradition which is actually connected, that there's a connection between the revolt of Africans in West Africa against being taken on the slave ships, that connects to the Quilimbos in places like Brazil in the 16th and 17th century, that connects to the Palmeiras, where you had like 20,000 Africans and also sometimes poor whites and indigenous peoples forming egalitarian societies together. That is connected to the Haitian Revolution in the 19th century. That there has been and needed to be an attempt to actually obliterate those histories in order to continue to rationalize essentially the ideological formations of racial capitalism as a material force. And there's a part in the introduction. He says, in England, at first gripped by a combative and often hysterical Christianity, complements of the Crusades, the Reconquests, and the rise of Italian capitalism, medieval English devout recorded dreams in which the devil appeared as a blackamoor and Ethiop. This was the part of the grammar of the church, the almost singular repository of knowledge in Europe. Centuries later, the satanic gave way to the representation of Africans as a different sort of beast, dumb animal labor, the benighted recipient of the benefits of slavery. Thus, the Negro was conceived. The Negro whose precedents could be found in the racial fabrications concealing the Slavs, the slaves, the Irish, and others, substantially eradicated in Western historiographical consciousness the necessity of remembering the significances of Nubia for Egypt's formation, of Egypt in the development of Greek civilization, of Africa for the imperial Rome, and more pointedly of Islam's influence on Europe's economic, political, and intellectual history. From such a creature, not even the suspicion of tradition needed to be entertained. In its stead, there was the black slave, a consequence masqueraded as an anthropology and as a history.
When in terms of the European mindset, the colonial mindset, setting the terms of this history, I think this book is so important, and Robinson's work generally is so important because it re-injects the reality that this history, which has been fought for so much, and there's so much has been tried to erase of this history. I mean, I was just talking before we was recording about Vivaldi Jean-Marie's book on voodoo cosmology, the Haitian Revolution, and the Enlightenment ideals of Kant and Hegel. His thesis about Hegel's response to the Haitian Revolution was that he only remarked about it insofar as he thought it exemplified European Christianity. It wasn't allowed to be on its own terms. It wasn't allowed to have its own cultural history. It wasn't allowed to have, a voodoo culture or an Obeah culture with the Maroons and the fugitive slaves. Any exception to the European rule is actually what reinforces it further. And Hegel and Hegelians are very much guilty of this particular kind of dialectical thinking, because it's that of the dialectic that always swallows things. Whereas in interjecting the African cultural consciousness in its own terms into the dialectic itself. Robinson's sort of triumph here is really to give the dialectic, it's an auto-critique of the dialectic and of Marxism and of Hegelianism and of the Enlightenment in general, insofar as, to use Hegel's own terms, it's incredibly one-sided. It has to culturally denigrate its own objects of oppression, insofar as it has to reduce them to nothing to then say, we have built it up again. It's like Cal, I can't remember who he said, if I've been to Tocqueville or someone talks about the English, how they talk about how they abolished slavery, as if they only ever had the institution to praise themselves for abolishing it later. Let's get into the meat of the book itself. So, focusing on 1983's Black Marxism. So the most influential part of this, arguably, is his diagnostic of racial capitalism as a formative element in the development of the world economic system. Thinking about things in terms of racial capitalism really puts a challenge towards how traditional Western radicalisms have put forward certain ideas about history that tend to put Europe as the center. With racial capitalism, Robinson re-injects the idea of ideology or consciousness as a material force into the wider historical analysis of capitalism and its world historical development. He wants to bring to the forefront what he calls the non-objective character of capitalist development. Could you just explain a bit about this non-objective nature of the capitalist development and the role it plays in the analysis and formation of racial capitalism as a historical fact? Because there's a certain scientismic tendency on Marxism's part where people hear the words non-objective and they go, subjective feelings. Feelings aren't real. We hit things with hammers. The economy is a big machine. It moves. It's sort of meat and potatoes, tub thumping leftism, as Owen Haverly once called it. What does Robinson mean by this non-objective character and this essential correlate to development of racial capitalism, or capitalism as an inherently racial entity?
I think it's a key question, and I think it's one we need to keep going back to, because not only in terms of its profound critique and some of the things that you talk about in actually some of its differences to Marxist interpretations or constructions of capitalism as a world system or as a total system, and also leading towards some of the scientism and what we might call some of the kind of materialist reductionisms of especially later forms of Marxism after Marx and Engels, but even in terms of some of their own work, that there's obviously been an explosion over the last years of racial capitalism as a term, as a concept, a framework, but has increasingly become more of like a buzzword, especially in like academic context. I mean, the reason there's been an explosion is obviously because of Praxis, is because of mass anti-racist movements, particularly the Black Lives Matter rebellions after the murder of George Floyd. That's, the reason it's come into more so like academic, but also social kind of like discourse is because of Praxis. But the way it's been treated, at least particularly in academia, has been to essentially have a normative left construction of capitalism, or if not a Marxist construction of capitalism, and then add race into it. When what Robinson is doing is actually entirely reconstructing our conceptions of capitalism, what it is, where it comes from, and how it emerges, and its relationship to the historical elements which build it. So a famous quote, which is always taken out of chapter 1, is, "The bourgeoisie that led the development of capitalism were drawn from particular ethnic and cultural groups, the European proletariats and the mercenaries of the leading states from others, its peasants from still other cultures, and its slaves from entirely different worlds. The tendency of European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. As the Slavs became the natural slaves, the racially inferior stock for domination and exploitation during the early Middle Ages, as the Tartars came to occupy a similar position in the Italian city-states of the late Middle Ages, so at the systemic interlocking of capitalism in the 16th century, the peoples of the Third World began to fill this expanding category of a civilization reproduced by capitalism." And so people tend to get that point, that when that racial capitalism it functions to not homogenize working populations, not to homogenize the working class, but rather to differentiate them for geographic, cultural, and racial differentiations in order to basically rationalize and continue to fill this expanding category of populations that can be exploitable or made surplus by capitalism. Yet the other processes that precede that quote I feel like I'm not properly engaged with. For example, at the beginning of the chapter, he says feudal society is the key to understanding this process. And I think that in terms of some of the scientisms of Marxism, or the idea that capitalism is in some circles, that capitalism is a rationalization of labor processes and that will then be overcome by the proletariat, that this idea of the progress of history, the development towards certain relations and modes of production, means that capitalism has dissipated with its most irrational elements, or rather the social and cultural and economic forces that have actually produced it out of feudal society, that it has done away with them rather than actually imbued them further and actually worked to reproduce them. So in the introduction, he says, in contradistinction to Marx and Engels' expectations that bourgeois society would rationalize social relations and demystify social consciousness, the obverse occurred. The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. I've used the term racial capitalism to refer to this development and to the subsequent structure as a historical agency. So his emphasis is on how the relations and particularistic racialisms of European feudalism, through the emergence of capitalism and thus the forms of imperialism and colonialism which constituted it, expanded into what he termed the modern, the tapestry of the modern world's social orders. That we have to understand those feudal relationships and the fact that these relations of what he terms irrationality, which later forms of European thought have basically attempted to displace, with a focus on the power of rationality, the power of science, and later to Marx and Engels, the power of a material analysis of history, have attempted to basically displace. And he's saying no, that they have continued through the reproduction of social consciousness as a material force. And just a last point on the non-objective character is that this is from the preface. He says, the masses, whom Marx presumed would be seized by theory, were European male wage labourers and artisans in the metropoles of Western Europe, Britain, and the United States. Here, both theory and Marx's casting of historical materialism betrayed him. Instead of the anarchic globalism of modern capitalist production and exchange, Marx imagined a coherent ordering of things, congruous imperial sites from which cohorts of capitalists cultivated, directed, and dominated satellite societies. For Marx, capitalism consisted of a geometric whole, whose elementary and often hidden characteristics, price, value, accumulation, and profit, could be discovered with arithmetic means and certainty. Driven, however, by the need to achieve the scientific elegance and interpretive economy demanded by theory, Marx consigned race, gender, culture, and history to the dustbin. So I think what he's trying to get at is that this focus on the ability to use theory as a weapon to construct essentially this elegant system of design, the totality, actually has ended up betraying Marx and then later Marxists in their constructions of capitalism in the ways in which the more irrational forces or more irrational social forces or forms of ideology, such as racialism, such as nationalism birthed from it, have been mystified to Marxists. And that so to say racial capitalism is not to say it's capitalism plus race. It's to say, no, it's this entire system which is in many ways this anarchic system of competing national bourgeoisies on a global scale, committed to the destruction and racialization and gendering of populations for their profit, no matter the destruction that the system will wrought. And that it's the irrational elements of this non-objective system that have been for so long mystified by Marxists and then later political economists and social analysis, which has attempted to synthesize it.
Robinson's a great example, and this is of the national question. Nationalism as a mix of racial sensibility and the economic interests of the national bourgeoisies was as powerful an ideological impulse as any spawned from these strata. And this, he said that completely bemused the founders of historical materialism. And there's, I don't say a reactionary element, but into pointing out the irrationalities, they want to bring things always back to the base production level of the rationality there, of the Smithian rationality of the invisible hands. But at the same time, it misses the very rationalities that precondition how does the material get to the factory in Manchester? Where are all these textiles coming from that people are working on, for example? And I do think bringing this ideological element into it is the It's a perfect way of doing things. Because, I mean, thinking about tradition, because the racial categories of Europe, in a sense, are a tradition inherited from feudalism. They are a way of marshalling national powers in war times, or especially as Robinson says, when monarchies started tending towards absolute monarchies. They consolidated their own aristocratic bourgeoisies around them and had to marshal competitions against each other. This element needs to be brought to the forefront because it is the heritage of capitalism, which it cannot simply say that it got rid of in, for example, the French Revolution, which is the essential model where we say, look, we cut all the heads off now and we have a new system, completely clean. I say a clean break, but it's more of a developmental negation. So actually it sort of grows over this and completely swallows and suffocates the old feudal order, whereas this clearly wasn't the case. And Robinson is quite good in his historical account of breaking this idea that there was a smooth transition from feudalism to capitalism. Collapse of the Roman Empire, feudalism, capitalism. He does a great job in talking about how actually there were latent capitalisms, whose material conditions were developing and were destroyed, for example, in the first outbreaks of plague in the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, completely. And I think it is where he says feudalism is the key, that there needs to be a deeper attempt to understand these deeper forms of essentially a lot of what it comes down to, and this is something I've been trying to understand recently, is his conception and construction of history. Joshua Myers does a good job in terming it as something what he calls black radical time, in the ways it does not conceive of constructions of the past or history or the present in the same way as a lot of dominant historiographies, as leading towards essentially the rationalization of social order. And I guess also I've been having difficulties with these constructions of modernity as well, in the ways in which even a lot of critical work, such as whether it's settler colonial studies or a lot of the decolonial work we're seeing coming out of Latin America, still takes modernity as this total disjuncture from everything before it. So even when they critique it, I think they're actually in some ways engaging in some of its own conceits. Whereas what Robinson is saying is that no, we have to see history more, I guess, relationally than that. There's a good quote, which I probably won't be able to find now, where he's talking about the uses of terms such as development or evolution and the ways that that has actually mystified our ability to actually understand history in this more relational way, rather than through constructions of this linear developmental history, which seems to negate everything in a total way that preceded it. And there's a line, both Perrine and Davies understood that the biological metaphor of a bourgeoisie emerging out of the Middle Ages, nurturing itself in the mercantilisms and administrations of the absolute monarchies of the traditional period between feudalism and capitalism, and on the lands and titles of impoverished nobilities, then finally achieving political and economic maturity, and thus constituting industrial capitalism, is largely unsupported by historical evidence. Rather, it is a historical impression, a phantom representation largely constructed from the late 18th century to the present by the notional activity of a bourgeoisie as a dominant class. This history of the rise of the middle class is an amalgam of bourgeois political and economic power. The self-serving ideology of the bourgeoisie is the ruling class, and thus an intellectual and political preoccupation mediated through the construct of evolutionary theory. Quote, "From Darwin has descended the language of error, a language that has locked up historical thinking and imposed slovenly and imprecise conclusions even upon scholarly and sensible researchers. Words like growth, decline, development, evolution, decay may have started as servants, but they have ended as masters. They have brought us to the edge of historical inevitability." And I think his understandings of history, I guess his break with dominant, both liberal and Marxist understandings of history, I think have allowed him to essentially see the relationships between the economic and political and racial modes within feudalism and their ongoing impression upon the present.
Notion of historical inevitability, we still find that people like Francis Fukuyama, as in some sense even Marx, but especially stuff like the Critique of Political Economy and the preface to that, even to some extent in Capital Volume 1, in the most hastily written section, which is a section on the expropriation of the expropriators, when he writes, "And suddenly it will get so bad, we'll have a good revolution, then we'll go home." This notion of historical inevitability is ultimately a self-serving notion where one treats oneself as the higher developed animal, but in clearing the way for this universal European sense of development, you have to erase the very people whose backs you had to stand upon to get to that point. In terms of where the intra-racial distinctions of Europe generated outwards into this European colonization of the world and division into different racial categories, you can see where this kind of evolutionary sort of pseudo-Malthusian madness spread across. Towards the end of this book, Robinson does say, why did I write this book? Because there is a crazed civilization let loose upon the world, and that is Europe.
It's the way he starts chapter 4, The Process and Consequences of Africa's Transmutation, by stating, in the 500 years that have led directly to our moment, the destinies of African peoples have been profoundly affected by the development of economic structures and political institutions among European peoples. Moreover, it has been the nature of these relationships between Africans and Europeans that both Western civilization and the cultures of African peoples have been increasingly contorted and perverted as the years have accumulated. For the West, the appropriation of the means and forces of African reproduction have had unintended and unacceptable significance. The psychic, intellectual, and cultural consequences of Europe's intrusion into African history have served to accelerate the formulation of the mechanisms of self-destruction inherent in Western civilization, exacerbating its native racisms, compelling further its imperatives for power and totalitarian force, while subverting the possibilities of the rationalization of its states, its diverse cultural particularities, and its classes. Everywhere one turns or cares to look, the signs of a collapsing world are evident. At the centre, at its extremities, the systems of Western power are fragmenting. Thus, the British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, the German Empire in the middle years of this century, and the American Empire today are simultaneously forewarnings, witnesses, and the history of this dissolution, and the development of each testified to the characteristic tendency of capitalist societies to amass violence for domination and exploitation and a diminishing return, a dialectic in its use. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. And so I think it's that point of the expansion of Western civilization through colonialism exacerbated its worst social and political formulas into essentially what you were discussing there at the end of the book when he says, a civilization maddened by its own perverse assumptions and contradictions is loose in the world. That a system of, and this links also to some of his other works, and such as An Anthropology of Marxism, where he talks about the much longer history than Marx gives it credit for, the much longer history of European socialism, that the ability to rationalize its states as diverse cultural particularities and its classes, the ability to actually create a better and more egalitarian society has been demolished by its ability through imperialism, colonialism, and its material reproduction of capitalism, through racial capitalism, has just actually exacerbated all of the worst forms of essentially this racial feudal system.
It's essentially dividing things, as you say, as Robinson says, race creates the difference between classes, and as this thing is loosed upon the world, we get more kinds of discrimination and castification than even thought possible. This is where you get things such as, for example, colorism coming from. It is this European logic of differentiation let loose upon the world. But let's move on from the sort of critique of Marxism to the real beating heart of this work, which is itself, the Black Radical tradition. So Robinson characterizes the Black Radical tradition as one of a total rejection of the subjection that colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, of course, are all as intertwined as each other, they're not separate conjuncts, have imposed upon the African peoples. And it perseveres for the proliferation of a kind of historical memory and the historical cultivation of a consciousness of resistance, and one that is continuous from traditions that, even though materially they may be displaced by the forced transportation of colonialism and the slave trade and mass oppression, still persevere as a material force of resistance that allows resistance on the terms of the African consciousness itself, rather than being put forward, being described, under certain Western radical ideologues or Enlightenment ideas of freedom, as someone like Hegel would have put it. One fantastic sentence he uses to describe the Black Radical tradition is it's the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. Could you explain a little bit more about what the Black Radical tradition is as a world historical consciousness for Robinson, and in the wider context of his work, and equally in the continuity of this tradition in the movement today?
This is one of the parts, especially chapter 7, where I think there's a lot of misinterpretations of what Robinson is trying to say. Particularly, I think, if people are coming at it from what we've discussed previously about forms of reductionist materialism that refuse to see ideology as material force. That in chapter 7, when he talks about essentially the power of consciousness and of epistemology. So he's talking about the violence in the Black radical tradition. And he's essentially saying that there was violence, of course, but in this tradition, it most often was turned inward. The active against the passive, whereas was the case of the non-case of 1856, the community against its material aspect. This was not the savagery as the gentlemen soldiers of 19th and 20th century European armies arrogantly reported to their beloved publics at home. Neither was it the fratricide of Fanon's extended Freudianism, and only seldom was it the devouring of revolutionary terror of the international bourgeois democratic revolution that Genovese's neo-Marxism has led him to acknowledge. This violence was not inspired by an external object. It was not understood as a part of an attack on a system, or an engagement with an abstraction of oppressive structures and relations. Rather, it was their Jonestown, our non-case, the renunciation of actual being for historical being, the preservation of the ontological totality granted by a metaphysical system that had never allowed for property in either the physical, philosophical, temporal, legal, social, or psychic senses. For them, defeat or victory was an internal affair. He then goes on in the next page to say, all of it was part of a tradition that was considerably different from what was made of the individualistic and often spontaneous motives that energized the runaway, the arsonist, the pioneer, the poisoner. It was more easily sustained suicide than assault, and its ideological, psychosocial, cultural, and historical currencies were more charismatic than political. When its actualization was frustrated, it became obeah, voodoo, Maoism, Pocomania, the religions of the oppressed. When it was realized, it became the Palmeiras, the Bush Negro settlements, and, at its heights, Haiti. But always, its focus was on the structures of the mind. Its epistemology granted supremacy to metaphysics, not the material. So it's these parts when you tend to get people, especially Marxists using it as a pejorative, saying he's a Hegelian. When I think what he's saying is a lot deeper in the sense that he's not saying that what constitutes the Black radical tradition is merely something like consciousness, or it's not just things that aren't related to material conditions. But he's saying that he speaks of Africa too, but for much of African peoples who were enslaved and taken to the Americas, what constituted the self, what constituted their being and their sense of self and sense of community was the relationship to forms of culture. And that was brought through from forms of ideology, and their resistance was brought through as a form of ideology as a material force, right? The point about this violence was not inspired by an external object is to say that Black radicalism emerged organically out of forms of not only resistance, but forms of attempting to live otherwise to this system that they had been torn out of previous cultural universes, previous societies, and thrown into these forms of subjugation, of slavery, and of capitalist exploitation. Unlike forms of radicalism such as Marxism, which he argues emerge essentially out of middle-class intellectuals, that it did not proceed from a theoretical understanding of the system that it was attempting to negate, that it emerged organically amongst African peoples that were attempting to separate themselves from a system that sought to exploit and destroy them. And one of the main points that if Black radicalism could be summed in a word, it would be reconstitution. To reconstitute the self, to reconstitute the community away from this system of slavery and of capitalist exploitation. I think Robinson's problem about saying that essentially that Black radicalism is formed in a similar way to the dialectic between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie in capitalist society is that he doesn't want to construct the existence and life worlds of African peoples as merely forms of resistance to oppression, but that there are forms of life, there are forms of culture, there are forms of what he calls historical consciousness that precede their envelopment by the world system. That it is not merely an attack on an existential system and structures of relations of oppression, but it's an attempt to negate the entire system by an appeal to something that actually exists outside of those processes. So back in chapter 4, when he's describing it, and he says, the makings of an essentially African response, strewn across the physical and temporal terrain of societies conceived in Western civilization, have been too infrequently distinguished. Only over time has the setting for these events been integrated into the tradition. The social cauldron of Black radicalism is Western society. Western society, however, has been its location and its objective condition, but not, except in a most perverse fashion, its specific inspiration. Black radicalism is a negation of Western civilization, but not in the direct sense of a simple dialectical negation. Then moving on, he says, Black radicalism consequently cannot be understood within the particular context of its genesis. It is not a variant of Western radicalism whose proponents happen to be black. Rather, it is a specifically African response to an oppression emergent from the immediate determinants of European development in the modern era and framed by orders of human exploitation woven into the intricacies of European social life from the inception of Western civilization. So the point is that it's not this form of dialectical negation, it's a form of reconstitution of the self and the community away from the structures of exploitation and from a kind of civilization, which is kind of what he's getting in his critique of Marxism, but he kind of gets at it in previous works too. And this is where we have to look at the broader scope of his work of things like the terms of order, is that when he says that Black radicalism was more charismatic than political, I conceive of that although I don't think he doesn't explicitly say it in Black Marxism, but he conceives of it as a non-political tradition rather than an anti-political tradition such as anarchism. He conceives it as non-political because, much as his case study of the Elatonga, which is a African cultural community in modern-day Zambia, I believe, that he basically, in his dissertation and what became the terms of order, he analysed the ways in which they essentially formed society through relations of kinship that were not premised on the political. The political, we said, was an ordering conceit, essentially born of the specific machinations of power to basically rationalise itself, and that Western thought has been unable to escape the paradigm of the political. He says that Marx partially recognised this, but proceeded to make a compromise with the political. But Marx himself recognises a difference between political and social emancipation. I think what he's saying is that the Black radical tradition is a form of social emancipation that emerges organically outside of the dialectics of antagonism and class struggle within Europe, and that it seeks to reconstitute itself outside of it.
Just talking about the difference between political and social emancipation, I think Robinson is referring to Marx's early text on the Jewish question, right, where it's not so much the idea of political emancipation being essentially you are given a double life, your life in civil social society and your life as a political subject. It's divided between particular and universal, right?
Yeah, as I believe.
Between private and public. Yeah. And in terms of being a non-political tradition, I haven't actually thought about it in that sense. I mean, not giving concessions, I think this is all about there's a great quote later on in the text where he talks about Mackandel, the Maroon leader, and using the idea of social hatred, the hatred of material force, capable of snuffing the lives from masters who had gone so far as to import their foods from France and then unloaded the precious cargo with their own hands, i.e. the French masters hid the goods from everybody, purely inspiring hatred in the raw, brutal oppression as it's shown so explicitly. And this was a motivating force to do battle, even to the extent beyond what Hegel historically called a mere attachment to life, and so did Marx. You see, if you thought slaves were only motivated by mere attachment for life, and there's so much historical evidence to the contrary, it's laughable they even said it. But he said when they won the battle, even their dead were free. They lived on their terms, they died on their terms, and they attained their freedom on their terms. And this notion of on our terms, this radical positing of autonomy, this radical self-assertion, it becomes a non-political one and said it doesn't want to play the game, or say the Schmittian game of friend and enemy, or conversing with this universal system, accepting the terms of the debate, that there is this universal mediating factor of a world system, and saying, no, we want to reconstitute the very material circumstances that we want to have from the past that has been bequeathed to us through a tradition which has survived through resisting and survived by resisting the very force of the system. I mean, otherwise, say that knowledge has no material force, which it would be funny if Marxists didn't write so many reading lists, but I don't think they believe that. I don't think they believe that either. And then that's no problem, comrades. Everyone's invited to the cookout, so to speak. Oh, I did pick up one quote, actually. This one really sums up the Black Radical tradition towards the end of the book when Robinson's talking about it. So, the Black Radical tradition suggests a more complete contradiction. In social and political praxis, it has acquired its immediate momentum from the necessity to respond to the persisting threats to African peoples characteristic of the modern world system. Over many generations, the specificity of resistance, at best securing only a momentary respite, has given way to the imperatives of broader collectivities. Particular languages, cultures, and social sensibilities have evolved into world historical consciousness. The distinctions of political space and historical time have fallen away in that the making of one black collective identity suffuses nationalisms. Harboured in the African diaspora, there is a single historical identity that is in opposition to systematic privations of racial capitalism. Ideology, it cements pain to purpose, experience to expectation, consciousness to collective action. It deepens with each disappointment at false mediation and reconciliation, and is crystallized into an ever-increasing core by betrayal and repression. The resoluteness of the Black Radical tradition advances as each generation assembled the data of its experience to an ideology of liberation. The experimentation with Western political inventories of change, specifically nationalism and class struggle, is coming to a close. Black radicalism is transcending those traditions in order to adhere to its own authority. It will arrive as points of resistance here, rebellion there, and mass revolutionary movements still elsewhere. But each instance will be formed by the Black Radical tradition in an awareness of the others and the consciousness that there remains nothing to which it may return. Moulded by a long and brutal experience rooted in a specifically African development, the tradition will provide for no compromise between liberation and annihilation. This is the beautiful forcefulness of this text. It is an abject stance of refusal, both on the academic level, where it's saying we refuse to ignore this tradition anymore, and is a tradition itself of refusal. I mean, I would love to know if this text made its way into Italy at one point, because the notion of refusal is so central to the Italian struggles of autonomia, for example. And this notion of refusal, I mean, we're seeing it now, for example, of the Great Resignation in places like the United States and to a lesser extent the UK and sort of the Eurocentric West in general. And this notion of refusal is, I was wondering what you think about this quote in particular and how we can sort of expand that into a wider understanding of the tradition as an active, effective renee, that is, and conscious force.
Well, yeah, that is one of my, I mean, so the way he writes is so poetic. It's one of my favourite quotes, but gets to the heart of how he conceives the tradition itself, which again relates to other works he done on, as I said, on the notion of the political, on mass movements, the constructions of and conceptions of the leader. But I think what you said before about it refuses to play on the terms of Western civilization, essentially, on the terms of it refuses to play the game in terms of the world system. And that on the point about it will provide no compromise between liberation and annihilation. The point about autonomia and refusal, I think, is very interesting as well, because when you look at his other works, if you look at things like An Anthropology of Marxism and Black Movements in America, where he delves more deeply into his ideas of consciousness and social ideology as a material force expressed through mass movements. I mean, he is very much about much of his work, and this is again something that's missed by the massive focus on this book, basically because Black Marxism posits itself, or has been rather presented as positing itself, as a critique of Marxism, when actually its threading is actually so much deeper, not only on his focus on the Black Radical tradition itself, but essentially on the nature and power of mass movements. I mean, some of his earliest works on things like Malcolm X, where he explicitly says things like, the point of people like Malcolm X was not to say anything new. It was to reflect what the masses had already said, or already saying. The becoming of Malcolm X was not to show that there would be a movement, but that there was already a movement there. So I think it's interesting in relating to things like autonomia and the ways in which he discusses the experimentation with Western political inventories of change, specifically nationalism and class struggle, is coming to a close. You know, much of his critique is not just from an African-centered perspective, but it is a refusal of, and we get this in terms of some of his engagements with C.L.R. James and C.L.R. James' critiques of things like the Vanguard Party. It's an utter refusal that the idea that social movements are rationalized by the authority of leadership, and that the forms of social ideology that are produced through resistance and forms of social consciousness and revolutionary consciousness are formed for the rationalization of the leader of middle-class intellectuals. That these are, this is something which Robin Kelly gets at in his book Freedom Dreams, where he's like, social movements are incubators of new knowledge. And I think this is his point about when he says that Black radicalism is an organically emerging movement. He means it's epistemologies too. And it made me think of at the end when he says, because this is again getting to the point where people say, he's Black centric or African centric or essentialist. And I think if you read him very carefully, especially when you read his other works, this cannot be the case. But if you read Black Marxism carefully, you can't come to that conclusion. When he says the second to last line of the book, whether the other oppositions generated from within Western society and without will mature remains problematical. He then says, but for now we must be as one. He's not saying that Black radicalism is, the negation of Marxism as to be the new system. He is totally rejecting that. He is saying that it is not the province of one people to be the solution or the problem. A Black radical tradition formed in opposition, conscious of itself, is one solution, is one part of the solution. There may be, and this is, I think, his point, and this is why he's focusing, he has a little bit of a focus on C.L.R. James's notes and dialectics, that he's saying that there may be an opposition, a force that actually emerges within Western society, within America, it's Anglo-settler colonies in Europe, such as forms of workers and mass movements, which may generate another form of opposition to destroy the system. But essentially, it cannot be based upon the forms of idolatry which have been created around something like Marxism. And that the point of his conception of the Black radical tradition, and then how it gets uncovered, he says, C.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and all the others he mentions toward the end, they didn't make it. They had to discover it. It was already there amongst mass movements. It was already there amongst Black peoples. And I think he would very much say that the point around socialism, this is what he says in Anthropology of Marxism, is that the ideas of socialism are already there. They don't need to be created by intellectuals. They can maybe be picked up on, they can be reflected by intellectuals, reflected by leadership, but the ideas, the substance, the praxis is already there. He says in the desire of the human spirit has exposed that the oppositions and resistance to oppression and poverty and inequality, that socialism has continuously, forms of socialism have continuously emerged in response to that. And so we have to understand his conception of the Black radical tradition as tied into his broader conceptions of things like socialism, his broader conceptions of things like the power of mass movements, and that Black radicalism is one form of, in its historical sense, form of reconstitution. But to get to the end of your last question in terms of where you asked its kind of comings today, where is Black radicalism today? He says in the preface, and he's talking about the kind of emergence of the Black radical tradition. But then he says, inevitably, the tradition was transformed into a radical force, and in its most militant manifestation, no longer accustomed to the resolution that flight and withdrawal were sufficient, as are the forms of obviously reconstitution we see with the Maroonage, the purpose of the struggles informed by the tradition became the overthrow of the whole race-based structure. In our present moment, that it is not merely, and this is, goes to his point about, in the Richard Wright chapter, about Marxism, or the critique of capitalism rather, being the beginning of the struggle for liberation. And this is what Richard Wright came to understand. But actually, it's the entire structure of this civilization. It's the entire structure of this race-based, this racial capitalist order, which needs to be overthrown. And his point about maturing is that he's like, the Black radical tradition from its inception has always understood this. Whether we will see, and I think he does believe so, he identified himself not as a Marxist, but as a socialist, that he conceived that other traditions would emerge in opposition to, maybe even join in struggle, we don't know. But for now, African peoples, Black peoples, and the Black radical tradition must consist of itself as one, as one in the strength of opposition to not just capitalism, but what we understand as the entire race-based order in which capitalism reproduces itself.
Absolutely. I mean, this text is, I think people will read it because they won't necessarily look at the subheading, the makers of Black radical tradition, and think about, and maybe immediately think about it as a kind of a program or a counter program.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is the new way, or this is a Black or an African flavor of Marxism. No, this is the pointing out of a parallel historical reality of resistance, which is impossible to ignore because it will always be there, and it has always been there. And insofar as you haven't got this, your analysis, it just doesn't, this Black radical tradition, the intention here by Robinson isn't to make a new hegemony of theory. It's not that, we have to throw all the Marxist department grant money has to go to people doing Robinsonian kind of analysis. No, Marxist comrades, put down your anxieties. We're not telling you to throw away the books. We're just telling you to pick up a new one. It's fine. It is not a call for a new hegemony. It is a call for a plurality of movements, not because there needs to be a plurality of movements, but because there are. There always have been. And I think rather than, this could clarify so much in terms of the debates that people are having in terms of, is X Marxist or is X Y ideology? Various anarchists and Marxists trying to claim Zapatistas. No, there's an indigenous radical tradition. Let's take it on its own terms. It's giving it to us on its own terms. We don't need to hegemonize this. And when a Hegelian guy is telling you this, you don't need to hegemonize anything into an all-subsuming dialectic. You may want to take a bit of a step back, comrades. Let's move on to my final question, which is just talking about sort of your work and the work you do with Palestine Action and Palestine Action's work generally. So, how formative or informative has Robinson's work been for you, both in the sense of your own research on Palestinian direct action and in the wider work or context of organizing in what you do today with Palestine Action and the recent direct action works against the Israeli drone factories in the UK?
Just to give a bit of information on my work. So I'm an activist with Palestine Action, attempting to carry out forms of drawing from Walter Rodney guerrilla activist research in trying to build, I guess, with my interactions with comrades, a construction of what is essentially the theory and praxis of Palestine Action, in which I do think that is something quite new in terms of not only Palestine activism in its relation to the BDS movement, boycott, divestment and sanctions, but also in relation to British anti-militarism, that I think it's not only, this is going to sound quite dialectical, but it's not only a bringing together of the two. I don't know, I feel like it's transcending some of the contradictions of both, some of the inability to go beyond forms of boycott action with the BDS movement into something more radical, and then forms of British anti-militarism, which sometimes fall into issues of whitewashing, problems of whiteness within the anti-militarist movement. So in relation to Robinson's work, I mean, one obviously has been the power of racial capitalism, is understanding the way in which Palestine Action is not only confronting Israeli Zionist colonization and forming one aspect of the internationalist resistance of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian movement, but the way in which a company like Elbit Systems has these global relations to imperial regimes, to militarist projects, to war making, to capitalist accumulation. I'm also arguing that Palestine Action is situated at an intersection of these global relations of colonialism, imperialism, race making, that it actually confronts racial capitalism at a more global level, as well as in its transnational relationship between supplying and creating weapons from here to Palestine. But the ways in which companies like Elbit Systems, which people may know, market their weapons as battle or field tested or combat proven on Palestinians. In 2014, during the Israeli invasion of Gaza, where over 2,200 Palestinians were killed, Elbit rushed the deployment of its Hermes 900 drone, not because they needed to use it, but because they wanted the marketing accrue, what would accrue from its marketing capabilities to say that it was combat proven in Gaza. The ways in which this non-objective function of racial capitalism to denigrate entire populations as either surplus or condemnable to have weapons tested on them for the accumulation of weapons and technologies which can be exported everywhere. Elbit drones are used in the US-Mexico border wall. They're used throughout the Mediterranean by the EU border agency Frontex. Elbit drones are now being used by the British Coast Guard and Maritime Agency. They're potentially being deployed by the British police. Israeli weapons are being used in Kashmir. They were used recently, a few years ago, in Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan. This global Israeli scholar Jeff Halper terms Israel's matrix of control is being used by the ability to test on Palestinians, accumulate those forms of technologies of pacification and control, and export them globally. So Robinson's construction of racial capitalism is obviously incredibly useful there. But it's been incredibly useful, some of his work, in understanding not only the structure of the Black radical tradition, but his structure of mass movements, in actually, for me, being able to really comprehend and, I guess, see in the way that, in a similar way, I guess, in the way we spoke about his constructions of time and history allowed him to see race, see history, see the elements of feudalism which emerged into capitalism in a different way. That it was his work that allowed me to see some of the functions of not only Palestine Action, but the Palestinian movement more broadly. So there's a part in the Du Bois chapter right at the end where he's talking about the revolutionary process of the general strike. And he says, leaders then led in increments. The northern field officers who put the fugitive slaves to work did not intend to free them, but they did. The Confederacy moved to preserve slavery, it helped to end it. Groups moved to the logic of immediate self-interest and to historical paradox. Consciousness, when it did develop, had come later in the process of the events. The revolution had caused the formation of revolutionary consciousness and had not been caused by it. The revolution was spontaneous. And so it's his rejection of the idea, which we see elsewhere in other places, that one must construct theory then apply, rather than theory being generated out of the very process of praxis, which, after reading that and reading more of his work, allowed me to really see the ways in which Palestine Action was operating. Was that it was not conceiving a theory of militarism, of Britain's relationship to Israel, although it was clearly there, it was embedded. Many of the activists have been part of the BDS movement for a long time. But what had raised consciousness now, not only within Palestine Action, but more broadly, had been the praxis of the actions themselves. I mean, one of the things I always say is that hitting an Elbit arms factory and occupying it, and all the kind of messaging and everything that comes out of that, there's more education than 20 panels or 20 presentations. Like, it's the process of the praxis which forms the revolutionary consciousness that we are now seeing growing in terms of not only opposition to Elbit throughout communities in this country, but also connecting it to broader relationships of imperialism and racial capitalism. And then on the Palestinian movement, what we were just discussing about a historical opposition to these forms of oppression and exploitation, which refuse the dominant orders. My favourite quote from Robinson has always been from the beginning of chapter 7, where he says, having arrived at a historical moment, at a conjuncture, at an auspicious time where the verities of intellectual and analytical imitation are no longer as significant to the Black ideologue as they once were, where the now current but dominant traditions of Western thought have once again been revealed to have a causal rather than systemic or organic relationship to the myriad transformations of human development and history, when, and this is the central issue, the most formidable apparatus of physical domination and control have disintegrated in the face of the most unlikely oppositions, India, Algeria, Angola, Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau, Iran, Mozambique. The total configuration of human experience requires other forms. And I think it's that has always stuck with me. The total configuration of human experience requires other forms, that the forms of resistance that we are seeing emerge globally in terms of Palestine, the general strike and the unity intifada, the forms of solidarities which Palestine brings out, exposes that, as we were talking about previously, resistance and revolution does not have to take the same form or take the same place or emerge from the same forms of material relations or forms of consciousness, that the myriad forms of human experience will express resistance in a myriad of different ways, in which I believe, at least, and this is something which Robinson continues to speak to me, is that, and in terms of my work with Palestine Action, that these almost indestructible forms of human oppression can have and will disintegrate in the face of what are unlikely oppositions.
Where can we find you? Where can we find your work? Where can we find Palestine Action? How can people get involved if they want to get involved? Where can people donate if they have the ability to donate?
Yep. So if people are on Twitter, they're at PAL, PAL_action on Twitter. Palestine Action is also should be on Facebook and Instagram. You can also, if you just type in Palestine Action on the main website, on Google, then the main website should come up, and that's where you can either join, donate, or if you'll get interested in getting involved in any way you can, or even with local groups, you don't necessarily have to go forward and take direct action. There's loads of media work or local leafleting that you can do in your communities and things. So get on the website and send a message, or just send a message through one of the social media sites like Twitter and Instagram, and then someone will get back to you.
Kieron, thank you so much for coming on to Convergences.
Brilliant, thank you. It's been an amazing conversation. Thanks, comrade.